I don't normally make a habit of doing entertainment news in this format, but this is quite a big deal and I don't have time to write a script for it as much as I'd like to, and do this in a very measured and considered way. I'm just going to have to give my first thoughts. And my first thoughts is that this is an absolute disaster for James Bond. Now, James Bond is one of those things that I grew up watching with my dad, much like Star Trek, and therefore holds a pretty special place in my heart. There's a few things that I will always remember, and one of them will be watching You Only Live Twice with my father.
From the film creators of 007.
Classic Sean Connery film. And like so many other franchises out there, we've had to watch James Bond change with the times, let's say. The fact of the matter is that the character of James Bond and what James Bond is no longer palatable. He is what would be considered to be problematic. And their attempts to address this by changing the character of James Bond in the last film, No Time to Die, where they killed him off at the end in a completely pathetic way and for a pathetic reason. Just that he couldn't see his supposed family again. James Bond killed himself for that.
I love you.
I love you too.
Couldn't find a way to say hello to them through 15 foot of plexiglass or something. Absolutely pathetic. It's not James Bond at all. Daniel Craig was all on board, but that's because Daniel Craig's basically a bit of a lovey prick. So yes, James Bond had already made some changes that people weren't going to like, and this is one of the reasons why it's been so long since the last James Bond film and there's been no announcement of a new James Bond film, because Barbara Broccoli was the custodian of James Bond. She was the one that said, look, no matter what, James Bond's going to be a male. Doesn't have to be a white dude. I mean, for years people were saying Idris Elba should be James Bond, and I would have been fully on board, because at the end of the day, it's just a code name. 007 James Bond is just a code name. I would have been up for that. It's the character of James Bond that needs to stay the same. He needs to be a devil-may-care, risk-taker, suave spy. That is the character at the end of the day, uncaring, unattached, and that's just not going to fly. You needed to have, for the modern audience, you needed to have the feminist, softer James Bond, and I say bollocks to all of that. But as I also say, unfortunately, that just doesn't work in the modern zeitgeist. Let's say it would be unpalatable to many who just can't take that kind of thing. What I would have done with it is I would have cast Henry Cavill, who should have been James Bond quite a long time ago. I would cast him before he is too old, and I would make a series, 2 or 3, rapid fire, old James Bond films, set way back in like the 60s or something, when that kind of stuff did fly. And I'm sorry, it just did. That's just the way it was. It's different now, great, lovely, it's all different now, is what it is. But back then, James Bond could go around doing what he was doing, and people didn't care. It was like, this is great, Bond girls and that kind of stuff, without any needs to bend the knee to modern sensibilities or the dreaded modern audience. Unfortunately, what has happened is going to be the opposite. James Bond just became a whore, because Broccolis have given over control to MGM, which is owned by Amazon, and Amazon are now going to milk James Bond to death. James Bond before long is going to look like a cow that has been milked to death. There's going to be a James Bond universe. I guarantee you're going to get female James Bond. You're going to get the Moneypenny series. It's going to be absolute shite. And the reason I know it's going to be absolute shite is because Amazon has form for this. In that when they made the Rings of Power, there was a custodian for that, making sure that what was produced was going to be in line and in keeping with Tolkien's writings. That man was Tom Shippey. And that man was unceremoniously kicked out the door so that they could spit roast Tolkien's mythology mercilessly. And I do not see it being any different for James Bond. I would rather James Bond just went away and we had the old stuff. Because there is no way, with the hierarchy and the likes of Jennifer Salke and all of that kind of thing at Amazon, and this being handled by Amazon, there is no way that this is not going to be an absolute shit show. And this is a tragedy. This is a British institution, a very British thing, which had steadily becoming more Jason Bourne-like. I think it's fair to say that after Casino Royale, the Daniel Craig James Bond became extremely thuggish, started to lose that suave, smooth, lady killer aspect.
Bond, the world's greatest gentleman agent with a license to kill. And he never misses a chance.
Aside from a few films that I did very much like, I thought Casino Royale was very good, and I very much enjoyed Skyfall. Those aside, I think the Daniel Craig tenure was a complete failure. And I'll be keeping an eye on this, but not with any level of enthusiasm. Even if Henry Cavill were to be cast now, with Amazon and MGM taking this over completely, Amazon are going to want to return on their investment. It's going to be hoard out. You're going to be seeing spin-offs. You're going to be seeing a James Bond universe. You're going to be seeing the complete desecration of everything that was Ian Fleming's James Bond. And as I said, there had already been some significant changes that I was not happy with. But James Bond is a relic of the past. Judi Dench's M said it.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War, whose boyish charms, though wasted on me, obviously appeal to that young woman I sent out to evaluate you.
And that is where James Bond needs to be. That is where his wheelhouse is. Nowadays, James Bond just don't fly, unfortunately. And unless you have somebody with an awful lot of talent, which I suspect there is a great lack of at Amazon, DEI Central. Amazon, we've got women directing every single episode of Rings of Power Season 2. How did that turn out? I just don't see any future for James Bond now. And it's sad. It is sad. So, yeah, that's kind of what I think about it. Completely unscripted. As I say, I just don't have time to write a script. I'm getting married in a few weeks. I've got quite a lot of things to do. I think this is a disaster. I think this is an absolute disaster. Broccoli, producing partner, Michael G, relinquished creative control. Yeah. One of the several people Deadline contacted and said, not in jest, I do think that it's possible that if God had sent us a totally no-brainer Bond in the last couple of years, then it might be a different situation. Henry Cavill is right there. Have you seen the man from U.N.C.L.E.?
Napoleon Solo.
The CIA's most effective agent.
I stole it.
So you're a thief? I hope you wear a mask.
Sometimes. Just never when I'm stealing things.
His Napoleon Solo was almost a perfect Bond. You just didn't want it. Because you knew that Henry Cavill would be A, a stickler for the law, and B, is the archetypical straight white man that you don't want to be James Bond. Otherwise you'd have him cast by now. That's probably what all the fighting's been about. A real shame. A real shame that the custodian is gone. The wolves are through the door, all over the corpse. And this is the real death of James Bond, unfortunately. Unless something absolutely staggering happens, this is the end. And they say it's all very well Amazon taking over, but the thing is they need a producer. And I mean a producer in the sense of a ringmaster. So, yeah, they're going to try and get somebody in to make this universe. Is there even going to be anybody British involved? Will James Bond remain intrinsically the British character that he should be?
Bond, the world's greatest gentleman agent with a license to kill. And he never misses a chance.
I don't want Jason Bourne. We've got Jason Bourne. We've got Jason Bourne movies. Make some more Jason Bourne movies. Do that, that's fine. James Bond is not Jason Bourne. James Bond is a completely different character. I see this being an absolute box-ticking, DEI, cinematic universe disaster. And I say here, explain that such meetings with the likes of Aaron Taylor-Johnson were just as a kind of ongoing keeping your eye on who's around. Aaron Taylor-Johnson would have been perfect if you're not going to cast Henry Cavill. I watched his performance in Bullet Train and I was like, yep, there's Bond. He can do it. Right, he played a very comic kind of character in that. Tangerine, or was it Lemon?
I'm Tangerine, he's Lemon.
Like the fruit?
Why they didn't do a prequel film about those, I'd never know. That's that kind of thing I would have definitely watched. Yeah, Aaron Taylor-Johnson was right there. You could have, Henry Cavill is getting to the stage where he's too old. But if you'd had Henry Cavill in mind when you wrapped filming on this, which is like 5 years ago now, I think the last James Bond, or at least 4 years ago, the last James Bond, came out. And if you'd had Henry Cavill, ready to go then, you'd have a new Henry Cavill James Bond film, ready to release right now to keep it going. But as it is, what's going to happen now is it's going to be rushed because Amazon want to get their money, want to get their sort of measure of blood, and it's going to be a disaster, an absolute disaster. Anyway, let me know what you think, guys. Thanks very much for tuning in. I have been Critic AL, and I'll be back with another video very soon.